The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. The Investment Fix podcast. Tune in today.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. No mai hoki mai ki a The Fold e mihi ne ko Duncan Grieve tōku ingoa. My guest today is Sanjana Hattotuwa, who is a Sri Lankan researcher who has basically been studying the intersection between sort of democracy and freedom and technology for the thick end of 20 years. He's a world-credentialed person and happens to have been in New Zealand working at Te Punaha Matatini for the last few years, and as a result has been here for some of the great, and I mean great as in scale, terrible as in outcomes, moments of our sort of that intersection of internet discourse becoming physical world, realities or harms. And honestly, the sort of difficulties I'm having articulating this stuff point to sort of how complex this job is. But, we recorded this on March 3rd, less than 24 hours after the sort of the ugly, riotous denouement to the occupation of Parliament's grounds. And as Sanjana says, he was watching it with, a million tabs open, with multiple apps, with a whole panoply of live streams documenting the thing. And that is basically where he lives now, is the sort of extremes of the information disordered, universe within Aotearoa, and watching ideas spread and watching platforms evolve, watching reach escalate. And, the reason I had him on the podcast was, he did an interview on Morning Report and has been tweeting about the extent to which individuals at the protest, at the occupation, were live streaming and creating content which was far outrating the reach of the entire of what you might call the sort of mainstream New Zealand media, and that was completely without precedent. And it lingered. It wasn't momentary. It would last for days, and it happened again yesterday. And I basically, regular listeners to this podcast or people who've read my writing have known about my disquiet about the extent to which things are happening on, social media and communications platforms, with massive reach, with no guardrails, with no oversight, with no consequences, for the wildly profitable venture capital funded companies at the heart of this, and that there is immense, social harm being done that is likely to last for a long time. And our response to this point has been to have some researchers study it or to express concern about it. And I wondered if, and I certainly heard this potentially in Jacinda Ardern's remarks at the 5:30 press conference on March 2nd, that we might be moving into a phase where we're sort of, as a society, as a political class, as the sort of elites who have the privilege of wondering about this stuff, starting to move into a more action-based era. And yeah, so that's like, I guess, the fundamental spur for this conversation. He's an incredibly, it's a kind of a miracle that he's here at the moment. This is someone who, we spoke afterwards, who's, worked alongside Maria Ressa, who, is a Nobel laureate for a reason. Who's been a huge part of the resistance to Duterte in the Philippines. And when you're in that kind of company, Facebook, platforms, and the spread of information on them in a really, molecular level. And you'll hear from this conversation that this dude is sounding the alarm in a really quite profound way about what is going on here and the extent to which we need to move this up our kind of concern pillar to right near the top. And that's how I felt for a while. I feel like this is the sort of shared understanding of truth is the platform on which every other problem gets solved. So if you're passionate about Indigenous rights or climate change or whatever it is, we have to agree on something and solve our disagreements through conversation and not by hurling cobblestones at each other. And right now we are starting to look like we're losing that shared reality a bit. So yeah, it's a heavy one, but I think it's pretty important to. Just before we get into it, I want to thank my sponsors in Vodafone, who have world-class technology that we're recording through right now. If you are in business and you need some internet, and you do, head to vodafone.co.nz. To find out more about their offer. This is Sanjana Hattotuwa on The Fold. Kia ora, Sanjana, and welcome to The Fold.
Kia ora. Thank you for having me.
I just want to get right to the thing which I feel like we're all over at the moment is the events that happened at Parliament yesterday. Did you watch the footage and what was your sort of response to it as someone who's been in the weeds of the social media communication side of it for over a long period of time, particularly this past month?
Well, the question is an interesting one because it's not just one channel or platform or app or live stream or video. It was a multiplicity of it. And that's also quite interesting and significant, and maybe we can talk about it later. But when you asked me the question whether I was tuned into it, yes, I was, but perhaps in a way quite fundamentally different to many of the listeners. I had multiple tabs open, multiple live streams, multiple sources of real-time information coming in, multiple sources of commentary around those channels and vectors. So it was, I suppose for many, an information overload, but that's the kind of work that the Disinformation Project does to ascertain what is the pulse of a context or a community or a moment or a movement or an incident or a development offline and how it's reflected online. It's not easy, you can imagine the cognitive dissonance, because I think what listeners also need to may not realize, but do need to understand is that all of these live streams aren't saying the same thing and are framing what is happening in real time and the protests as well in fundamentally different and divergent ways that are actually quite stark. It's not as if there are, some similarities between some of these frames. Depending on who you listen to, it's really fundamentally different and divergent. So that's a long way of answering a question. I was plugged in and tuned into it. And the second part of it is also quite interesting because, again, many listeners, if not all of them, would be Kiwis. I'm not Kiwi. I'm Sri Lankan. And this is what you call an information disorder that I have literally grown up with for decades. And then subsequently in my adult life have, for the past 2 decades, studied and being immersed and enmeshed. And from that perspective, I have a very different take, I suppose, to many, to what happened yesterday. It does affect everybody. And it was very disturbing to see. But I suppose the one thing that I can bring to the table is that it is disconcerting and anomalous to find here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that which I have studied elsewhere and for many years prior. It is as anomalous as, say, dengue or malaria in the Arctic or polar circles. That's something that you don't see. And if you do, there's something very wrong because those are tropical diseases that you shouldn't be looking at, studying or observing the spread and entrenchment of in conditions that are certainly very far removed from what you would normally associate them with. So from a global south perspective, nothing I saw yesterday is new, but it is phenomenally frightening and fascinating in equal parts to see its entrenchment and expansion at pace here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And we can talk a long time just on that. But for the record, it was very disturbing. I mean,
no, totally. I mean, and to be honest, like that, that's a strong opener, and that's precisely why I was so excited to have you on, because there was this sort of cognitive dissonance of seeing. I think Toby Manhire wrote about it in a piece for us this morning about you're seeing scenes that are familiar, the kind of the clashing between police forces and violent protest, and yet the backdrop was unfamiliar because it was both familiar, as in it was Parliament, it was unfamiliar, as in we've never seen those things juxtaposed before. And that is why I think, for a lot of us, we've had this kind of sense of Aotearoa exceptionalism where we think, man, that stuff that's happening over there is crazy. It won't wash up here, even though all of this a lot of the preconditions in terms of the discourse that you monitor were there, and they were just looking for a moment, which we'll get to all of this, and I'm excited about it. But I wondered if you could, just by way of kind of background, tell me about how you came to be interested in the relationship between a sort of, what you might call civilized society or democracy, and the internet, and how that has flowed into your role at the Disinformation Project with Te Punaha Matatini.
Well, it's an interesting phrase that you use, civilized society, and I wonder what that means, because that means very different things to very different people.
That's true.
And one of the, at the time we're recording this, one of the problems that people of color have is with the depiction of Ukraine as a country in civilized Europe, and some of the very racist tropes and leitmotifs and frames that media across the world, including European media, have used to somehow project it as it's the only in the uncivilized world, however you see it, that these things are more familiar with. So, I mean, that's an interesting phrase that you use, but I will take it to mean there are tenets of democracy that we can all aspire to, subscribe to, and hold valuable and cherish. And as a Sri Lankan in Aotearoa, as an outsider, these are things that one hasn't seen in one's own life. And there are things that are worth fighting for and defending in terms of liberal democratic traditions and institutions and processes and foundations. Also going back, pre-treaty days, and post-treaty. So it's not as if it's a Western importation. It's deeply rooted in Maori cultures, faith traditions, and worldviews and perspectives. So this country has a rich history it can draw upon. And as the backdrop of the canvas around which so much yesterday was extraordinarily disconnected from and violent towards. So it's interesting that you asked that question, because my interest has been from what you now have words for. You call them information disorders, you call them dis and misinfo. There are acronyms, there are, academic studies and frameworks and whatnot. But let me tell you a very personal story. I mean, I grew up in a country of at war, in 1983, when I was 6 years old. I went to sleep because our house is near, what turned out to be a major airport. It's actually a small domestic airport, but it turned out to be the airport in which, or to which the casualties of war from the north of my country came in to go to hospital in the capital city, Colombo. So I went to sleep with, these huge turboprops. In the 80s, you didn't have jet, you had these turboprops, and it was quite noisy. But then the morning after, the government or the state media heralded huge victories for the army. And there was no talk whatsoever about the casualties that were flowing in throughout the night. That was very evident to the neighborhood around the airport. So it was the patina of experience is etched with the disconnect between what are official narratives and, for us in Sri Lanka, what were more grounded narratives. So I kind of grew up with the skepticism of the narratives as presented and promoted by the state, which I suppose was my pathway to interrogating in my adult life the role of social media, the role of information, the role of media generally, even pre-social media, and how, I suppose, if you can distill it to one thing, how what is talked about online now informs and influences what happens offline, and how what happens offline, which I suppose many listeners would recognize if I used a different term, in the real world, I suppose, is what listeners would immediately recognize. We don't use that because for many who are online, the online is as real as what they would physically interact with. So most listeners would recognize it as a real world. And for us, it's what happens in the real world, how it informs and influences conversations and content online. We call this a symbiotic relationship. One influences the other. And it's always that, there's a conversation happening between the two. My PhD was what brought me to Aotearoa, which I was looking at the information disorders in Sri Lanka. And I also did the first research in Aotearoa looking at the manner in which almost exactly 3 years ago, the Christchurch massacre played out on Twitter, which is a chapter. Obviously, I didn't intend to ever write it, but it was a terrible, tragic event that I was witness to as a consequence of being in the country. And I pivoted my research framework and foci to look at it. And I did. It is a chapter. And so it's with a lot of background that's also grounded in Aotearoa that I now look at the information disorders that have arisen as a consequence of, more recently, the L4, L3 lockdowns mid-August, starting 17th August 2021. And so I have more concertedly studied what has grown at pace, disturbingly, is now entrenched, is expanding, and shows no signs of plateauing either. So we can talk about it more, but there were things that happened during the protest on the 10th of February in particular. And at the time of recording this, the day prior to recording this, on the 2nd of March, that are historically unprecedented in the media landscape of the country, leave aside the disinfo and misinfo landscape. So there are things of utmost significance, extraordinarily unprecedented things happening that I think we should pay attention to, and not just in academic ways. I think listeners would, their eyes would glaze over if I were to talk about the ways in which we study this. My point is a very simple one. It's a very human one. No matter who you are, no matter which side or position you occupy on the political spectrum, we should be concerned about disinformation because it is a cancer that erodes our trust and confidence in democratic institutions. And very importantly, and this is, I think, what would really resonate with Kiwis, it really impacts the way we negotiate difference and how we see each other. That's what I'm very worried about.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was kind of like, there can be many different types of civilized society. There is no one, but it's one where you resolve your differences without hurling cobblestones at one another. And that's the thing that I would quite like us to maintain and try and work towards a better version of it rather than what we saw yesterday felt like, it has the potential to be anomalous, or it has the potential to be a harbinger of, a much more sort of violent and unsettled period if it swings a particular way. I want to get into all this. I mean, I'm worried that I'm setting us up for like a 15-hour podcast, but just quickly, like you described earlier, you described the way that you watched this in real time is you didn't just have the stuff live stream up. You had a million tabs and monitors. And I'm kind of curious about how you as an individual go about monitoring people who would, some of whom are trying to, there is a kind of a version of it which is trying to move minds and bring people into the movement, and another which is very much trying not to be monitored, and then also trying to synthesize that into something that you can kind of coherently output. Do you want to talk a little bit about your sort of methodology and the where and the how?
It's an important question. So I'm not police. I have no aspirations to be a surveillance entity or an intelligence entity. My background, my belief, my faith, my DNA is structured to first principles and human rights, simply because I have grown up with a paucity of it and in a vacuum where the state and the police have been part of the problem. So I am a protester. I am very partial to protest and democratic debate and, holding government accountable. But what we are seeing and what we have seen and what the protests are something very dark and very different to all of that, and the front-facing performative versions of what it was projected and promoted as by some in the protest itself. And that's my take on it, which was, the study that we do is all public domain content. Nothing is accessible through, for example, what some listeners might identify with the dark web, or the marginal, parenthetical, peripheral zones of the internet, which are hideous and heinous and hellish.
Would you include in that just, for example, closed Facebook groups or Telegram, gated communities?
No closed Facebook groups are monitored. Telegram, yes, because anybody with a Telegram account can obviously download the app and then access the content. And Telegram is the problem. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, well, and because I feel like on some level there's like a funnel where, Facebook can, an algorithm can introduce the sort of the seed of an idea, and then basically you get led into a place with no...
Yeah, but you have to be careful about that. So just to clarify for the listeners, I think many of us after Haugen and, the disclosures that have gripped the world with around Facebook and other social media companies, YouTube included, associate harms with algorithmic harms. However we understand it, I don't want to get into it, but we have come, we're used to hearing about algorithms and how they lead into rabbit holes of toxicity. So let's take that as a given. Let's appreciate it for what it is, and then understand it for what it is as well, and acknowledge it that is a problem. But this is, I think, where most listeners would find fascinating, and is actually fundamentally different to social media platforms that we more often talk about. Telegram is not algorithmically controlled. There is nothing algorithmic about Telegram. Another way of looking at it is that the entirety of the sharing and the commenting and the production and the seeding and the cross-pollination of content is organic, is by human user, follower, subscriber interaction. And it is significantly different to Facebook in that regard, because, there is nothing that, with Telegram as a company, stops mis and disinfo. There's nothing. There's no policy that governs it. You could argue that social media companies have all the policies in place, and I think that's the
frustration. It's an enforcement issue, right? No, the only reason I mentioned Facebook was because I think that Telegram does seem to be where the action is, and I'd love for you to talk about what you see there, but more about you can't just walk straight into, you don't just walk down the street and think, actually, I'm going to start thinking, viewing the world through a conspiratorial lens and just go straight in at the deep end. You have to be taken there, and the early steps often happen there. And I guess I am curious about the extent to which, or how you see people kind of, like, are there sort of radicalization journeys, that are almost like a user journey kind of thing that have kind of been created out of this environment? Because you must have been watching it happen very quickly in this kind of compressed spell, because we saw the convoy become what it ended as over a much more compressed period of time and with a quite specific group of people.
A lot of what we saw after the 6th of February were evident for researchers like myself for months prior. So, I have to stress that. Nothing that we saw during the protest or the convoy, as much as the convoy was actually, as you correctly point out, something that emerged very, very quickly, was surprising. In academia, we call this a path dependency. There was a certain dynamic and a signature that we studied around the growth of this content, where it was growing, who was producing it, who was engaging with it, how it was being cross-pollinated, the way it was spreading, how it was spreading, over what. So there's a lot of, it's like a farmer would look at irrigation. And when you look at the irrigation patterns for a while, you kind of figure out which way the water is flowing and where the well springs are. And we had seen this for months prior. So, to disabuse listeners that this is a phenomenon that only occurred at pace or was introduced to Aotearoa after the 6th of February. However, there is merit in what you say, which is that there was an acceleration.
It's scaled, right?
It absolutely, and scale is also an interesting term. So what we saw was it was a greater volume, there was a greater velocity, which is a speed, and there was more diversity in the vectors, which is the platforms. So volume, vector, and velocity. And then there's also another way of looking at it, which is in terms of speed, scope, and scale. So there was an accelerated production of violative, harmful material. There were greater audiences to which it was reaching. And then there was also in terms of the number of issues or the number of people or the number of conspiratorialism that was kind of married to that content, that also got more complicated and complex. So, for example, I'll just give you one example because listeners might find this a bit abstract. What listeners would normally associate with, because, we've been reading about it, we've been hearing about it, and we've been concerned about it in terms of the QAnon conspiratorialism, associated generally, I suppose, with many still with the United States. So very far away from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and everything that we saw go wrong around the 6th of January Capitol Hill insurrection, before, during, and afterwards, including after 2016, actually, all of that vocabulary, all of those harms, every single target, every single way of looking at the world, every single target that is part of that QAnon conspiratorialism is here.
So it's quite chilling, but we also can't deny it after the events of the past month, particularly yesterday. We'll take a very quick break and come back with more from Sanjana. The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
So one of the things that, I think where you which you've spoken about and I think is really interesting to people, because on some level, like we are, or a lot of us are products of or have a familiar understanding of scale of audience within mainstream media environments. And when you transfer to social, there's less visibility of scale audiences, and we understand that everything's cut into a thousand niches, and whatever your vision of social media is unique to you, which makes processing some of this mentally harder. But one of the things that you have drawn attention to is the extent to which what you might call the disinfo sort of cinematic universe was at times scaling well beyond what the reach of quote unquote mainstream media. Tell us about that, and how shocking that those spikes were, and how rare that was as a sort of a phenomenon.
I mean, I'm struggling to kind of explain that in a way that listeners would comprehend the significance of it. Even for us, it was extraordinary. We've never seen anything like it, particularly on the 10th of February, which I have written about on my Twitter account, and I've tried to kind of communicate the significance of to Kiwis. We have never seen a small group of entities, actors, producers of dis and misinfo on the platforms that we study, which are namely Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and Twitter, and also by extension TikTok. So, the leading social media platforms, quite independent of Telegram. But, if you take Facebook, I mean, the general understanding is that there's a lot of good people on it, not necessarily people who are interested in violent extremism. But what we saw on the 10th of February is that a dozen accounts in particular, but also more generally, the constellation of accounts that the Disinformation Project look at, not just exceeded, but by order of magnitude, exceeded the entirety of the country's mainstream media accounts that we could discover and study on Facebook that day. And that pattern held for 72 hours. So just to get the listeners' head around that, that means that a very different perspective of the protest, which was extremely violent, harmful, and married to violent ideation online, for whatever reason, and that discussion goes beyond this podcast, but for whatever reason, generated, particularly with regards to video, by order of magnitude more engagement than the entirety of the Aotearoa New Zealand mainstream media. It's never happened before. And on the date of recording this, actually, what happened on the 2nd of March is even more extraordinary. I can't name names, but there is one leading misinformation producer on Facebook whose live streams at one point, on the 2nd of March, featured around 22,000 concurrent viewers. We've never seen that, ever. And if you took a look at it, at the time of recording this, I'm still crunching through the numbers, but if you took a look at it, that individual's Facebook live streams, and there were many during the course of the day, researchers have a tool that is able to capture Facebook engagements that are pegged to a particular country. So I took a look at all of the Facebook pages in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that one individual's live streams are in the top 5 of all pages in Aotearoa, New Zealand. That is not something that the history of media in the country has seen. That is an extraordinary data signature. And the implications of it, I will just add by saying that a lot of listeners would think that this is academic or technological. Yes, it is. It is both. But you see, the fear that we have as researchers is that what is being discussed and how, who is engaging with it and who is commenting on it, invariably determine what we talked about earlier, which is how we see ourselves offline.
This is the thing, right?
This is the thing, actually, and that is the worry. So it's not just techno-social or technological or technocratic. It is gendered. It is rooted in communities. It affects Maori and Pacifica and other communities in this country differently. And so it's going to impact any which way you cut it, social cohesion moving forward. That is my worry. That is what drives the Disinformation Project.
And I think that's kind of really gets to the nub of this. Is I think for a long time we kid ourselves. Even Christchurch, just utterly appalling. The terrorist act on March 15. There was it was a lone wolf radicalized by 4chan. There was an ability to kind of abstract it away to an extent, even though it was clearly a product of an individual being taken on a particular journey. I think one of the things that's hardest for us to understand, because we have these sort of individual views of them, through our own interactions with them, is and because the government sort of tacitly endorses that by using it, by using them as a functionally official channels, having thousands of staff for whom their main job is monitoring and interacting on them, it lends them an imprimatur of a kind of endorsement, even though you might see these wildly different things. And that runs headlong into a trend where institutions are broadly degrading in trust while individuals, creators are kind of accelerating in trust to particular people. And then you get an event like the one you describe where the sheer scale of reach and of the profundity of that engagement dwarfs that. 22,000 concurrent streams is just a fantastical number. Like that would be a significantly rating channel on all but basically TVNZ and sort of 3 during prime time kind of thing, and it was just happening yesterday, completely unmonitored. And I guess the thing that I find, I still would love to get your perspective on is live stream is where, that's the origins of the Christchurch call. We acknowledge it as being that level of a problem. The spread of disinformation and this piece in the broader sense is something that Facebook has boasted about spending, $13 billion on over the past 5 years, and yet this still happens. I mean, is whatever is being done working, and are there, solves for this that you've seen that might kind of arrest this sort of seeming like slide into whatever the hell is going on here,
Listen, these are fundamental issues you raise, any one of which is a podcast at least. I think you raise a very important point, which I think listeners need to kind of latch on to as well, which is what my PhD is about. It's very easy to hate on these mainstream platforms. I'm not talking about Telegram. I'm talking about, say, Facebook or YouTube or Twitter or even TikTok. But what you touched on is fundamentally important, which is that there is a simultaneous interplay of pro-social official actors using what are very, very important tools in outreach. For example, with United Against COVID-19, they couldn't be, or the Ministry of Health, they wouldn't or couldn't do what they do without the platforms helping them with vital vectors to reach a community and a population. And so that is simultaneously occurring with the instrumentalization and weaponization of these platforms. And that is the conversation. Therein lies the rub. When the West says, with a privilege that they don't quite comprehend, to delete Facebook, people like myself, we laugh. Because that is a luxury we don't have in the global South. Facebook is our life. It's integral and inextricably entwined with our social, our love life, our governance, our politics, our commercial transactions, everything is running off WhatsApp or some sort of Facebook product or platform. So that is the problem, that these companies in Silicon Valley have enmeshed themselves differently in Aotearoa versus the global South, but have enmeshed themselves in public and social life. And then what do you do? Because regulation and relevant applicable laws are completely not fit for purpose. They are playing catch up. And while they play catch up, the disinfo and misinfo, agents provocateurs and actors are way ahead. And this has been a dynamic that we've seen in the global South for far, far longer than Aotearoa, but it's catching up, and no longer can Aotearoa's geographic exceptionalism inoculate or immunize against that which is already present and growing at pace. So the other question, or amongst the other things that you asked, is Facebook doing anything about it? And listeners wouldn't know, but I started laughing when you asked that question because, again, I must, I can't but not take a global South perspective to this. These are questions that you're asking me today on the 3rd of March, 2022, that we started asking in 2012, almost a decade ago, when nobody was interested in what we were highlighting and with evidence showing was the weaponization of these platforms to significant harm offline, to instrumentalize it, to amplify it, and to spread it. So we have been seeing this for over a decade. And in as much as can be determined, the company is still struggling. Now, I must be very, very clear that the company is struggling, and the emphasis is on a struggle. There are committed individuals and teams within Facebook and these companies who are, who don't want this, who don't want to see the company's products and platforms being perennially involved in the promotion and production and propagation of harms and violence. But the problem is that there is a deep disconnect and rift between the profit-making enterprise and the policy and the principled enterprise. And that seems to be a divergent that seems to be a disconnect which continues at, in 22 as much as it was a decade ago. And that's where the problems lie. Because if you just talk about live streams, I tweeted out on the morning of the 2nd a series of tweets that told Kiwis, please tune in and switch off. Because we know what the communication of violence over live streams brings about. And you know it too, after what happened 3 years ago. And so I also put up some resources around how Kiwis could report violative material, because I was really very worried that what would unfold during the course of the 2nd of March wouldn't just include burning tents and projectiles at the police. Even though it was obviously very violent, one was always concerned throughout the course of the day, given the degree of ideation that we found present and pulsating online, that things would go pear-shaped very, very quickly. And so I'll end by saying that there is nothing at all that reassures researchers like myself, who have been dealing this for close upon a decade, that Facebook's oversight and controls, particularly over live streams, and by the way, this extends to other forms of social media live streams as well. Every platform has its own version of a live stream, is fit for purpose. It is always ex post facto, where they kind of first have to determine that there is something going on and then minimize what the live streams contain and can communicate. But that time lag is the problem. There's always a time lag. And we are not confident that Facebook understands that live streams are now today the primary vector and vehicle around a lot of what for the past 22 or 23 days has been framed, has framed the protest. But moving forward, also, it's just the way that mis and disinfo is predominantly communicated. And that is the least controlled by all the platforms because of the nature of it. I mean, I think listeners would understand, if I were to use an expletive on this podcast, post-production, you could edit it out. But if this was live to air, that would be a different matter altogether. So imagine if my expletive was a call to violence. And imagine if anger and anxiety sufficiently at a critical pitch then translated that into offline behaviors and perceptions and actions, what we call kinetic or physical harms. It's very real. Yeah, the danger is very real,
and I think that's this is the thing that's difficult. And what you said before about the global South having been talking about this forever. I've heard Maria Ressa speak. There was the genocide in Myanmar, like some of what's happened in India around Hindu nationalism spread through WhatsApp. These are all Facebook platforms, and this is one of the things that I thought that came out of the Facebook, the Hogan revelations that was particularly kind of arresting was the extent to which the sort of wraparound care associated with Facebook as a product in the US basically exists because both economically and politically they can demand it in a way that as soon as you start to venture into less economically sort of central or more maybe where there are layers of linguistic challenges to sort of covering it for at a particular level, it's just a whole different level. And this was just an absolute peek into that, which is an entire governing reality in some of the countries that you're referring to under that catch-all.
Yeah, but you would think that. But just on that point, one of the great learnings for me here is that I came with the expectation that because Aotearoa and New Zealand are OECD, Five Eyes, Global North, Christchurch Call, it's creme de la creme, and it would be a cherry, a feather in the cap of Facebook to kind of get its act together. And I thought, because of the dominant language is English, you would imagine that algorithmically and through machine learning and artificial intelligence, it would be very easy to kind of maintain a greater scrutiny and oversight over, arguably, as you correctly noted, my country, which, the language is only spoken in my country, just like in Myanmar and Burmese. And so you would think that the situation would be very different here. But here's the thing. There's nothing to suggest that Facebook has any greater handle on things that are going awry on its platforms and the manner in which it is being instrumentalized. And this is, by the way, just to be very clear, not just related to the protest, but leading up to it for months prior, that they have any greater oversight, handle, or handle around. And that's quite extraordinary. And that speaks to systemic issues within the company that extend across the geographies and markets it operates in. Of course, there's an asymmetry, with certain countries and languages and contexts. Obviously, it faces greater challenges, but it isn't the case that Aotearoa is greater secured against platform instrumentalization just because the dominant content and language employed on their product and platform surfaces are English. Frankly, that really surprised me.
Okay, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to ask you one final question. I mean, it's been so fascinating. I so appreciate your insights on this. And this theoretically should have a yes or no answer. But do you believe that Facebook's products and the sort of more broadly speaking, the social media environment is reformable in a way that can retain some of the very real social value that is created by these companies and platforms and meaningfully mitigate some of the harms which they, I think are now manifestly kind of exporting to the literal steps of our democracy?
Yes, it's a complex discussion, but yes, there are things that can be done and should be done. There's conversations around new policy making in the United Kingdom that are instructive in this regard, the European Union, across the Tasman in Australia. All of these have problems. None of these are perfect, but it is a very complex problem that changes every day. So you can't have a mindset that sees regulation and lawmaking as the end point. You have to talk about it as a continuous process that is all of society and all of government. And let me end by saying that, Aotearoa is extremely well placed in the global community to lead this discussion. You have an extraordinary repository, quite a unique one, actually, of, being able to harvest cultural, communal, treaty-based Maori, post-treaty, but also Maori values that are fundamental to, and extraordinarily so, technological media regulation moving forward. And those are conversations we need to have, Aotearoa needs to have. So the simple answer is yes. The more complex answer is that whatever that we have today is not fit for purpose, and whatever that has been proposed in the public domain in Aotearoa is also not fit for purpose, which begs then the question as to when we are going to have the discussions that matter to stop these harms from propagating and being promoted at pace that will impact social cohesion in the future.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating, and the whole thing is like, it does feel like the response is always, it's really complicated and that thing won't work for these reasons. And unless you propose something which is perfect, which is by its nature impossible, then then the whole apparatus, the whole discussion gets dismissed out of hand. We could do it again. Maybe we will. I hope so. Thank you so much, Sanjana, for coming on The Fold today, and good luck out there. It's very important work you're doing.
Kia ora and good luck to all of us.
True. Thank you. That was Sanjana Hattotuwa on The Fold. Really appreciate him making the time to do that. I also appreciate Te Ahe Butler for recording and editing this podcast. Jane Yee for running the Spin-Off Podcast Network, Callum Henderson for his role in wrapping editorial around it, and most of all, always the Spin-Off members. Moments like this, when society gets hot, when history gets made, that's when we sort of really feel the urgency and the privilege of what we do, and it's not a lie, we couldn't do it without you. So if you're listening and you are one of our members, a huge thanks from all of us here. Ka kite. That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to O Media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
K-pop to me means more than just listening to music. It's learning to be myself.
The Spin-Off's new documentary, K-Pollies, follows 3 Pacific youth obsessed with K-pop. In a one-off documentary, see what they've found in Korean pop culture and how they bridge it with their own.
When you start dressing, looking different, everyone side-eyes you. But in K-pop, they're just like, no, like celebrate yourself.
Watch K-Pollies today at thespinoff.co.nz/videos. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. The Spinoff Podcast Network.